this opportunity. Oops, here we go. Let's begin with this opportunity to just simply arrive, starting with the sound of the bowl, letting it resonate through your being. So I invite you to close your eyes just briefly for this moment, if you feel comfortable doing so. And let the sound of that bowl be a call to presence. I am here, but am I really here? Have I given myself permission to arrive, be present, set aside what it took to get here, set aside what I might be doing after this time together, and give myself the gift of arriving now? And it might be helpful to start with your breath. And as you receive your breath in this moment, notice how, as you inhale, there's space created inside of you. And maybe you might notice that there are parts of you that aren't fully here. You can invite those parts into that space and use your breath to support you. Maybe you came smiling, but you aren't actually that cheerful in this moment. Maybe it's okay to bring forth what you're actually feeling. And then check in with your physical body. Just very briefly, you can notice the sensation of the breath in your body. And then see if you can even breathe into the space of your thoughts. Help make space there for insight and wisdom to emerge from within you and from others in this group. And then I'll ring the bell again and bring us back. Open mind, open heart, relaxed body, as we enter here now together into the sacred space of our togetherness. And so it is. Thank you. Give it back to our hosts. Thank you. Renate, you are muted.
Yeah. Well, hosts, So we'll do our check-in, and Ingrid's usually the one who has a bright idea as co-host of this community for what we could chat about for our very brief 5-minute, 6 minutes, because we'll have 3 people, 2 minutes each, just to meet somebody in a breakout room by way of a check-in.
In a breakout room to talk about the state shift that you experienced between arriving and Nhien's meditation, and what does the crossing of a threshold into presence feel like for you in your 3 centers? So what is the state change that you experience in becoming present?
Okay. So we've got, and anything else, you can obviously just find out who you're talking to and where they are. I've included the co-hosts. You're welcome to come out of the breakout room if you wish. And we're going into breakout in 3, 2, 1.
All right. Hello, everyone. And again, I'm Reverend Nhien. I'm the founder of Evolving Enneagram, which is based here in Kansas City, Missouri, but especially, through COVID has roots now all over the world. So what I do is I have a contemplative and compassionate approach to transformation using the Enneagram that is rooted in, again, contemplative spirituality. I am an ordained interspiritual unity minister. My groups have individuals that some of them are spiritual, but not religious. We have Muslims, we have recovering Catholics, contemplative or mystical Christians, pagans. And so we really do run the gamut in our spiritual community. Yeah, so we lead weekly contemplative Enneagram groups where we practice a form of meditation called centering prayer. And I also do a lot of one-on-one work. And I'd say a quarter of my time is consultant work. I consult on a program that supports caregivers of individuals with dementia. And so that's been really rewarding work that I've done. And then now, more recently, a quarter of my time is spent working on my book, and the working title is Enneagram of Soul. So that's just a little tidbit. Oh, I should also share my background. My undergraduate degree was in philosophy, and I practiced law in San Francisco for about 9 years until I got this very irrational call to ministry. So my life, so people were like, oh, why did you go? I was like, it's not like a rational decision, this thing, so it was a calling, and I have not looked back since. So yeah, that's just a little bit about me. And with that, if it's a good time, I can launch into today's presentation. So when Renate asked me to share today, I realized that a lot of what I do is more like facilitation than it is at this point, like didactic or presentation oriented. But I wanted to give you at least some framework for how I use the Enneagram so that there's a touchstone for you. And then after that, it's really meant to be today an open discussion. I want to hear what's alive for you. And as I shared in our small group, my ideal is that we're not just asking, even though most of us are Enneagram professionals, that you're open, that you feel comfortable asking questions for your personal life or for your own inner journey. And I'm generally, folks who are in my community know that I'm pretty open to sharing about my personal journey as well. So, because I feel like we lead from who we are, and so that's core to the way I approach my work. And I may not be able to see everybody, but please know that I am not easily diverted from my focus. So feel free to jump in and ask a question, even in the middle of the presentation. There, again, will be ample time afterwards. But if you feel like, oh, I want to ask a certain point, feel free to just jump in and unmute yourself. But know that it will be recorded. So if you want to ask a more personal question, maybe at the end. So with that, I'll launch into today's, I call it a mini presentation. I might have gotten a little carried away with how many slides. So let me move all the faces here so that we can see the slides. Waking up with the Enneagram, a journey of involution and evolution. So today I definitely want to define what I mean. So waking up for me is that journey of spiritual awakening to what I would call our true nature, not a true nature that is static, but a dynamic wholeness that is like our essential nature, if you will. And I'll define involution shortly. So I wanted to start with a real life example. I know Tom's on this call and knows John very well. It's important for me to not get overly abstract and to start with a real case story. John Greenleaf Maple has been a longtime member of our evolving Enneagram community, and he identifies as a type 9, sexual dominant, sexual social self-preservation. And when he first came to me, I remember when he snuck by like a little poetry book that he had written. And like, you know, there's this classic 9-ness around why should I share this work with others? It doesn't matter anyway. And the beautiful thing about his journey, as I witnessed it in the first several years of being together in community and working together one-on-one, is he suddenly started to become more engaged in his life. And so, whereas for a while he wasn't producing anything, like he started becoming more creative. He created these Enneagram pieces of art here. And it was just this astounding thing. And he began to post them. And it was just this powerful gift that he had that he wasn't now hiding under a rock, you know? So it's just as an example of some of the things I see in my ministry work, if you will, to understand that when I talk about waking up, and this process of involution and evolution, that it's not in the abstract, that there's this concrete way it shows up in people's lives. And John, to me, is a testament to a 9 who has begun to show up and know that like what he shares matters in the world. And his creativity has just been just beautiful and boundless. So wanted to share his art here and with a little credit. So the core of my work, as you might have felt in the opening meditation practice, is rooted in this idea that, my God, I mean, as a lawyer, I know that we can argue left and right our beliefs. And as a minister, same thing. There are these arguments about theology. And there was always a part of me that's like, there's something beyond this. And when I encountered A Course in Miracles, which is one of the primary wisdom traditions that informs my work, I just like fell in love with this quote. So if you're in my communities, you'll hear this a lot. A universal theology is impossible, but a universal experience is not only possible, but necessary. And so the aim of my work is this experience, this unitive experience, an experience of love, an experience of peace. Some of you may have heard of that classic Buddhist tale that so often the teacher is, the finger pointing at the moon, and the students get wrapped up in the finger, and they don't realize the point is to see the moon. Yeah. So the idea is don't get too wrapped up in the teaching. The teaching is designed to point us somewhere. We already did making space with the breath earlier. That's a practice I love. And I don't know if, let's see, the faces here hide this. The core approach that I have to the Enneagram, and I know I'm not original or alone in this, is this idea that you are not your type, that you are this dynamic whole, and that the wholeness is represented by the circle of the Enneagram. So whenever folks are new to my work, like that's our starting point, that there's a dynamic whole that is sort of unnameable, unlabelable, and organic, etc. And so when I first encountered the Enneagram, I personally had hit bottom in my life and had begun a 12-step program of recovery related to sex and love addiction. And I remember the moment when this happened, a friend who was concerned about my conduct at the time asked, like, what in you is so empty that you feel you need to do this kind of thing? And that statement just rocked my world. I was like, oh, everybody else thought it was impressive. And like, here's a moment where someone could see through into the emptiness inside of me. And so my journey began with this journey of questing for my individual wholeness. And the Enneagram came about the same time, and I could like relate to that Enneagram notion. But I also want to say that I label this wholeness and emptiness because in the contemplative spiritual tradition that I come from, the path of liberation is a path that is about self-emptying. And so this idea, it's an apophatic path. So the path of centering prayer that I teach and I practice comes from this notion of you go into the silence and the ego, you're driven by the personality type, is like, oh, no, you need to be doing this instead. You need to be thinking about that instead. Everything instead of opening to what I would call the sacred or the divine. And so in the beginning, I was like, I just want to feel whole, like I'm okay. And then later, I began to recognize that this circle, which looks like an O, is also like a 0, that there's something about self-emptying that enabled me to then find that experience that I was questing for before. And, like, it's not something that I just think, it's a felt or sensate experience of being, of wholeness, of connection. And through my wholeness, I began to then start to experience a sense of unity with other people. And so much of my work is drawn from my personal experience. So the law of one is not just about wholeness for me, it is about emptiness. And Nisargadatta Maharaj says, love says, I am everything. I am the whole. Love says, I am everything. Wisdom says, I am nothing. And between the two, my life flows. So the daily practice of becoming nothing, and then in that nothingness, finding I am everything. I am part of the whole. And again, feel free to chime in at any time. My concept around the inner triangle is derived primarily from Sandra Maitri and Hamid Ali's work. He goes by the pen name A.H. Almas. But in the Christian tradition, there's this notion of the fall. And to take a step back here, I know this is a more advanced Enneagram group, but I want to make sure that that I clarify what I'm talking about here. So we're talking about the Enneagram now as a map of consciousness, not just a map of personality, but in a way saying this whole Enneagram is you or is me. And the points on the Enneagram reflect aspects of consciousness. And so the idea that 0.9 represents our, first of all, the holy idea of holy love, which is our unity. But on the egoic level, it represents our belief that we have separated from the oneness, from God, whatever you want to call the divine, right? And so here's that 9. And this movement then of like, holy crap, existential fear and angst at 0.6. So this idea that like, I believe that I'm now separate from infinite love, infinite wisdom, the ground of being. And so there's this profound existential fear and angst represented by 0.6. And then instead of actually feeling that profound existential angst, we go to 0.3 down here and we develop a persona. And so the way I teach the Enneagram is that all Enneagram personality types live at, not type 3, at 0.3. So there are 9 personas that we develop to make it in a world where we believe I'm it, and I've got to hustle for my good in whatever way it is. I got to build enough security. I got to get people to like me. I got to like create peace, or I got to just fall asleep to my existential angst, So whatever the strategies are of the persona, And the reason this model is very helpful to me is I find that when I work with people, the first step is take a look at this persona and all the contours and recognize that this is actually the way home, right? But it blocks the way home because the persona, here's A Course in Miracles again. A Course in Miracles has this line that says the ego's mantra is seek, but do not find. Seek, but do not find. So each of these false selves or personas looks to create in the world an experience of something, right? Like a condition in the world, like enough security, enough love, enough admiration to offset not feeling it within. So if we can identify that, we can begin to then allow that false self to break down, stop doing its compulsive things, then the horrible news is then we drop back into existential fear and angst. So the idea that of supporting people in knowing that there's something that this persona is designed to hide. And if we can experience it, we can actually go back home to 9, holy love. That's the journey. And the beautiful thing about this, and I'll jump a bit to say that for me, involution, even though I'll talk about it in a sec with a different slide, I want to share about it here. For me, from a unity tradition, we talk about this process called involution. It's almost like this idea that oneness involves itself in humankind, in life. By involving, we kind of mean like we differentiate. It's oneness deliberately perceiving separateness, because there's this idea that oneness cannot experience because there's no subject and object. But if there's an illusion of separation, then oneness can experience life. Wow. But so when we drop from that oneness, like it's not just a mistake, it's not something bad, but it's part of our reality. And so not making that separation, quote, mistake wrong, but a part of wholeness itself. And so the divine involving itself in humankind, if you look at biological evolution, there's this movement toward greater complexity. And, like it's almost like the oneness falling asleep, becoming rock, and then rock becoming, plant, becoming human, and then humans waking up to our oneness with the divine. And so involution is that path towards separation and self-forgetting. And then evolution is the process of waking up. But what I like about this inner triangle is, for me, it's not a linear process, like, boom, back to oneness, everybody, that's all we want. But it's this idea that as we open to our oneness, we are like what some people call Jesus, which is this awoke person who is says the Father and I are one. But the big story about Jesus is that Jesus is God incarnate. Right? It's an incarnational experience. And for me, that's just a representation of, wow, I am the divine, fully embodied. But the difference between Jesus and me is I forgot that I'm divine as well. And I think I'm a little, petite Asian girl hustling for her worth. And that's all I got. And I don't even know that I am already one with all that is whole and worthy. Right? But if I know that doesn't mean like I'm just now back in this oblivion of oneness. There's this way in which, and this is what I explore a bit in the Enneagram of Soul book, that at the point of me, if I am awake, then I am not suffering the delusion of separation. And I'm still using all the finest qualities of the point 3, embodying that, but not driven by the 3 afraid, right? In that sense of separation that has to compete for its worth. If I already know I'm whole and worthy and connected to that, then how am I showing up in the world with my particular gifts of 3ness, for instance? That's the core of the way I teach the Enneagram. So again, involution, the act or an instance of enfolding or entangling, involvement, oneness falling asleep to itself, oneness experiencing itself as multiplicity, Again, not a bad thing, but a source of suffering if we believe that we are not the ocean and we think we are just a wave on the ocean and we are about to crash and there are other waves that are bigger than us and better than us, but if I know that at core, I am the ocean expressing as a wave, my life is different. So conscious evolution for me is simply that oneness as many waking up to that oneness. And so I'd like to describe, to not overly shame it. For me, personality living from the ego is just like living from the circumference of the self. So right there on just the surface of the self, not just the three, but every type, right? And then individuality living from essence is living from that awakeness that isn't necessarily like, I don't like when people say we were all the types. I think that we have access to the fullness of our divine potential, but we are unique combinations of that fullness. We're not like equally every number. And also type for me is our persona. And we can say like we have access to all the points on this map of our humanity, if you will, and this map of our divinity. So again, the Enneagram is described as 9 ways of sleepwalking. And so this is about how waking up to this divinity by first recognizing that the Enneagram persona is a way of being asleep to our fullness, to our wholeness, to a larger ground of being than our own egoic identity would testify to, right? And so this is a famous quote, and we don't know if Anais Nin was really the first, but we don't see things as they are. We see them as we are. And this is often an idea shared in Enneagram circles, and I've taught it a lot, but I have to revisit it again and again and again, because like I walk into a room and I really think I see the truth, right? Like that I'm not seeing through a kind of a lens, right? Just that reminder. And so these barriers to presence, again, this is probably a little longer than I was expecting to do, but I'm going to just briefly go through this because I know this is a well-versed group here. But this is not the end-all be-all. These are just examples of a way that we can look at each of the 9 worldviews. I want to say that from the spiritual perspective, when I do spiritual work with folks, I tend to also like to describe it as your theology. Like, how is this different from what you believe is the nature of you in the universe, right? So the world is filled with imperfection, and I must correct and perfect it. The 2, others need my help more than I need theirs. I must give where I can. I mean, thinking about your own number and how does it impact your relationship to the divine, right? My life will, for 3s, my life won't just unfold. I must stay ahead of others and work hard to succeed. 4, something deep and profound is missing. I must find that special something to be fulfilled. 5, the world gives too little and takes too much. I must protect what time and resources I have. 6, life is filled with hazards. I need to stay vigilant to keep myself and my loved ones safe. 7, the world is full of exciting possibilities. I have to experience them all. 8, the world is a rough and tumble place. I must be strong and self-reliant and avoid showing weakness. 9, the world is overwhelming. I must maintain inner and outer peace at whatever cost. Again, just examples of how the delusion of our particular type can express in how we broach the world. And I would say that here's an example of how my 3ness can show up. I identify as a sexual, social, self-pres 3. My life won't just unfold. I must stay ahead of others and work hard to succeed. Well, I encountered something called functional atheism. I was like, oh my God, I was a minister at this time. But I heard functional atheism is this idea that you can say you believe in God, right? Like this divine presence carrying your every activity, and the holy idea of 3, like this movement, the activity of the universe, just moving, and I'm part of that flow. And I could, in theory, believe that, but I was seeing that I was burnt out at that moment in life. And I was like, oh, functional atheism is I live as if it's up to me. I live as if it's up to me. And that is what I actually believe, that like it's up to me. a lack of trusting and believing in the divine presence. So I can see this is my theology. And so that work of, oh, I better meditate more. Like, I remember that moment of like, oh, I was starting to get ahead of myself in terms of sort of leaving my practice to make sure things get done, because if I don't do them, how will my life happen? Right. So that's just an example that you might consider for your own type. Like, what is this story that I keep telling that tells me about like my perspective on, I mean, for me, theology is like, what is my view of the divine? What is my view of the nature of the universe? Right. Like for the 8, like, is it black and white? Is it good and bad? Or is there gray in there? Like, what is my view of the universe? Right? And my place in it. This is theology for me. And this invitation that all the folks I work with really don't like, but love, actually, in the end, which is, it comes from Michael Singer's book, The Untethered Soul. We are constantly trying to hold it all together. If you really want to see why you do things, then don't do them and see what happens. So the urgency of your type that says, oh, I have to please them or make them like me. The urgency of the type that says, oh, I have to remain undisturbed and I have to get away from this so that I can be undisturbed. And like, if we don't do it, what I have found that our ego starts to break open. If we resist what that personality type structure says, you must keep it this way. Right? Like, yeah. So for 5s, because I've been focused on certain types, an example is I have 5s in my group that like, don't go down that rabbit hole. What happens if I don't go down that rabbit hole? It's very uncomfortable at first, but then I've seen 5s in my ministry. One started writing poetry because he got in touch with his heart more relationally, and another 5 then who was actually facing his own mortality with a terminal diagnosis started to talk to me about mystery and his increasing comfort with mystery, to live well and then for him to die well. And that is ultimately what happened. He passed away just a couple months ago. Yeah. Of course, my work, and this is just a little tidbit, my work is in community. And one of the things why I said yes here is when I first came a few months ago to the first community of practice experience, I was like, oh my God, this is like our community. It's so loving and supportive. And there is something about doing this together from a place of compassion that I felt here. And so there is an encouragement that I have of like, whether it's this community or another or multiple ones, but to find support in being together in this Enneagram literate community. So that compassion. And then just, again, I'm going to just breeze through this, just compassion for our passions and recognizing that. So instead of going, oh, well, 8s do that, or 3s are like that, or 1s, there's this increased compassion, not just individually, but in community where we're like, yeah, their pain is different from my pain. That's as hard for them as my thing is for me. And I can have compassion for the ways that my self-deceit mostly will show up as a 3. And as a result, I begin to actually have more compassion for the ways that aren't mine. Like I say, for the 9, that self-forgetting, that sloth is definitely, pretty far from how I show up in the world. But if I get it, that it's as hard for them to leave that place as it is for me to not self-deceive, then I have more compassion. Okay, I'm gonna maybe say that for the end. And okay, I'm gonna just quickly here, I'm gonna skip over to this. So the basic idea for me is the invitation of the holy idea is a source of support on the journey because of this Enneagram of delusions that comes from the work of Almas. You can look at it, localized love at 9, localized rightness at 1, the sense of a separate will at 2, which is like my wants are distinct from the wants of the universe, the separate doer at 3, the separate identity at 4, the separate self at 5, the sense of no true nature at 6, the separate unfoldment at 7, the sense of duality, again, black and white, at 8. This idea that by laying hold, by opening up, by letting go of our egoic strategies, I think we receive the holy ideas as gifts. And that gift of spirit then helps this lens to break apart, so that we're not seeing the world through this lens of like localized rightness for the one. Like there is, by localized, there's this sense of like some things are right and some things aren't right. There isn't just a fundamental perfection and rightness to all life. Like there's a distinction that the one makes that carves out good and bad, right? And so there's this idea that if you're looking at the world through that lens, then you're going to constantly act out the compulsion of, I go into an environment, I see what's wrong, it disturbs my peace, and I never kind of come into the serenity that is the virtue of the one, because then I'm still believing in this delusion. So instead of correcting the world, right, we open up to the holy idea of holy perfection that allows this healing salve to allow you to have a felt experience of that holiness within you, first and foremost, and then from that place to see the world not through the Enneagram worldview, but what I might call the divine view, to see the world as, quote, God sees it, not in any personified God, but like through your eyes. So that's just an example of how this works. And I'll close. So this again, I just wanted to offer the overview of, I work with this framework a lot, but I don't feel like, I mean, if you want later, we can go back to this slide, the ideas and the fixations, the virtues and the passions, but I'll close with a Rumi quote. This is mainly for 9s, but it is the 0.9 in all of us. Don't go back to sleep. The breeze at dawn has secrets to tell you. Don't go back to sleep. You must ask for what you really want. Don't go back to sleep. People are going back and forth across the doorsill where their 2 worlds touch. The door is round and open like the Enneagram. Don't go back to sleep. People are going back and forth across the doorsill where the 2 worlds touch. Earlier, I talked about Jesus. And again, this is just one example of a modern mystic, I think. He stands to me at the doorway, where back of him is the notion that I am one, the Father and I am one, but I am an embodied expression in this world. So my personal goal is I stand at the doorsill. Sometimes I have to go back and remember that God nature, and then I come back to the doorsill. This is the point at which I touch the material and the real, that I live an embodied life. This is where the 2 worlds touch. The door is round and open. Don't go back to sleep. So thank you. And I will now close the slide. Yeah. And that's my idea of a mini presentation. So and I'm open to, I want you to know that, that I very much am not attached to my particular perspective. I think of it very functionally. Like this is the perspective I personally come from, and I see it produce fruit in the lives of those I work with. But I know that there are many metaphors and many philosophies, and I'm super open, to questions that even test and question that, I don't want to just be like, oh, like it's not just about upholding, my own framework, but of sharing it in hopes that you can take what you want and leave the rest, which is from the 12-step tradition. But most importantly, I'd love to answer like personal questions about how this might apply. So our circle's open, our grid is open.
I don't mind kicking it off. I've got a question that I was wondering about, if that's okay. And that is about how do we overcome these negative, what Brendan Graham Dempsey, I don't know if you know his writing, he's amazing, but he speaks about psychotheologies. And Richard Rohr also speaks about negative anthropologies that we've internalized. So for example, like personally, I somehow internalized the idea that the only way to grow is by being fucked over by life, basically. I'm sorry to use that language, but it is the most appropriate. That's the way that we grow and come to realization, is through immense suffering. And then I see the Rumi quote, and many things that have been happening for me in recent times is that there's what Richard Rohr also speaks about as a superfluity of grace. How do we give up our negative anthropology, our tortured psychotheologies, and that whole conditioning, and allow ourselves the risk of accepting grace? And I know Cynthia Bourgeois, I'm sure you know her work deeply, is speaking about the hermeneutic wager. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. Is how do we begin to accept grace?
Wow, what a powerful question. And yes, Cynthia Bourgeois and Richard Rohr deeply inform my work as well, Father Richard Rohr. So I think that what the Enneagram teaches is there isn't a generic answer to your question, right? That this, like, how do we open ourselves to grace? For me, one of the questions I ask the most in my group is, what's alive for you? What's alive for you? Because what's alive is already energetic. And so when I can meet you at the point of what's alive for you, you're already interested, right? So in that point, and it so happens that my belief system is that, especially, of course, in Miracles talks about a holy instant. You know, Leonard Cohen talks about there's a crack in everything, right? It's like this idea that we only need a crack, just one little ounce of willingness. They even say, you know, that an ounce of faith, right? Like a little seed, like to support you and people in knowing it just takes that moment, that break. And then Viktor Frankl, right, is always a great example for people, because talk about a man, he's so the author of Man's Search for Meaning, and he survived the concentration camps. So, I mean, my life, right? Yes, mustard seed, thanks, Jill. You know, my life, it like maybe was not as traumatic, but to talk about his life, right? And he says essentially between stimulus and response, there is a space, right? And in that space lies your power and your freedom. And so that's what I might bring up for people, right? You only need a second of openness. And then the whole of grace can come rushing in. The whole of grace. And then you find yourself speaking the same story again. Oh, yeah. And the story of suffering. And it's a little bit, and then, like, if I'm working with you, I might notice, yeah, you're a little bit proud of your suffering, eh? It makes you like, so then we start to explore oh my gosh, these are the positives of my suffering. This is what my suffering is doing for me. This is what this is doing for me. I can get really clear, because instead, you know, part of me is like, I'm just going to hate my suffering and, you know, but secretly want it, right? But it's this confrontation from the most compassionate point of view that can say, okay, for instance, for me, you know, again, identified as a type 3 for the longest time. I also believed that I was a 1, and there's a lot of hard work ethic in this. And then I look at my family. I'm from a refugee. So I'm a Vietnamese refugee. We landed in the United States and we hit the ground running to like rebuild our lives. And definitely, my mom's probably a 2. I come from a story of work hard. I remember when I was, quote, complaining to my older sister about a summer in which I was like, oh my God, Van, I was working 15 hours a day trying to rebuild my finances. And my whole church community was like, oh my gosh, that's so hard and painful. My Unity community, my sister's like, great. Just, I was like, no, I mean, my body was hurting. She was like, well, great. I mean, just the story of like the suffering is the good, and that was a huge part of my story for the longest time. But instead of going, oh, that's horrible, right? Because my head thought that's horrible. But I'm like, you sure talk about how hard you work a lot, Nhien. You've got something vested in that. You've got something vested in that. And it's about me because I built my life. If I allow that divine grace like moves in, like my ego does not get any props for that. No props, right? And so if you look at your particular brand of suffering, right, whether it's numbing out, that kind of falling asleep suffering, where it's this constant like two-ness of like almost trying to manipulate someone else into, staying with you, right? Into not abandoning, right? To receiving your gift like that. Like there's something vested that we have in that keeps the ego structure. And then that openness that says, forgive that moment. And of course, in Miracles, I love the line says, choose once again where you once made a faulty choice. So like, even if it was a moment ago, I acted out in a way where I'm like, that's unskillful. I might be like, well, I am open. I am open to divine forgiveness and divine grace. And, for some of you who may not, believe in, I don't actually believe in a God out there. I just believe in like the oneness here, but it can feel like it's coming from a different part of me, like my higher power, my higher self. Right. And so there's room for that. And then if I make room for that, what I have found experientially, not because I read a book, is that something changes over time. Right? That I become changed, that I don't need this thing anymore. My life, people will see it and was like, oh, you work so hard. I'm like, I actually don't. I don't. And if I feel like I'm efforting, I stop. I seem to create, I like the word creative rather than productive, especially from threeness, like I create more, but it comes from a different place. It comes from like a joy, right? And so when I follow that and I trust that, that's a part of when I talk about faith, it's not in the abstract, it's in the everyday of trusting that if I follow that desire, I think, the Rima quote says something about like, to know what you want. I mean, that's the deep need for the nine, but for all of us. And to believe that the divine, that what we want is the divine wanting through us, and to trust that, right? As opposed to scan the world for what seems to be admired or desired, and to reply to the world rather than to move from the inside out, right? Like that. And so if that's helpful, just a speck or a space. Oh, so Viktor Frankl, that quote from Viktor Frankl, for me, the meditative journey, that practice helps to carve a bigger space so that in the moment when I'm about to tell that same story about suffering, there's just a little more breathing room there. And I can choose a different thought. I can choose a different action. So sometimes for some of us, especially the thinking types, where you're like, well, I know I have this thinking, right? Like, but I need to do. So sometimes that wedge in the spoke of things is just do it. And the only way I can possibly teach this is, I think someone said it earlier, as a leap of faith. Because the point is, you don't know until you do it. And here, to me, that's why the faith journey is so important, because all of us, it was like, well, Nhien, can you make sure I'm going to succeed if I follow your path? Can you make sure that my family won't break up with me? If I follow your path? And no, I cannot guarantee that, right? But there is a promise and a hope that when we take this leap of faith and act outside what we've been habitually acting, there is a world and an experience much more phenomenal and loving and supportive than anything we could have fathomed. Because I know that the life I live today was a pipe dream in the past. And again, I know many of you don't know my personal story. I thought I was the loneliest person in the world. I didn't have friends at all through like my early 30s, right? And I mean, if you see the way I'm in community, in friendship now, like you can't even, I was so shy, I couldn't speak in a room of 10 people. I would whisper. I remember my teachers would call on me and be like, yeah, speak up. Like I couldn't speak. Like that's who I was before doing this work, opening to this work. Like it changed me in a way that I could never have willpowered my way into. And again, I'm talking a lot about me only to give the example of like, I don't teach what I don't live. Like I don't offer what I don't live. And there are some great examples in our community as well, like with the type 5 I shared earlier. I've shared very openly about his story of coming into his heart space, a type 7 who wanted connection with her type 5 partner and didn't know why she wasn't getting it and couldn't see that after she asked him a question, that she would talk into the space of the answer. She was so fast thinking and fast talking, and she couldn't see how she had not made space. And in his final years, she was like, they had been married longer than I've been alive. And she shared that she had experienced finally the intimacy that she had always wanted with him, but she didn't know how she was stopping it because she didn't know how not to jump in until she started practicing centering prayer. She doesn't do it perfectly and she doesn't do it all the time, but she did it better. But it started her on a path where she could catch herself and pause and listen rather than talk. So she could finally receive him. Right? Yeah, I hope that was helpful.
Yeah, thank you. Really lovely, like taking it out of a theoretical domain into deeply experiential. And what I'm hearing there, I kind of think of from my trauma work as a corrective experience, that even if we have one momentary experience that is outside our core belief system, that challenges our habitual frame, that provides us with a relational encounter that we didn't know was possible, that then our capacity for connection and our experience of love, can incrementally grow through these corrective experiences that we have again and again.
That's a great analogy. Yeah. Yeah, it is. It's because the difference is it's not just a thought. It's an actual experience. And the experience only arises if we don't feed the compulsion. But the Enneagram helps to name what our compulsion is that we might not even see in that moment. The compulsion to have another thought, to learn a new thing, right? Like how many of us in the Enneagram world to learn a new thing after that book, right? After that teaching. But how about now? Like, am I even open to the idea that it will finally be now and here? Could it be right now? Not like after the session when you apply this, right? Right? Yeah. And that via negativa, the path of emptying, because I can see thinking happening, as I'm watching, I was like, and it might be, here's my compulsion is to figure it out. If I don't understand it, I can't live it. Maybe that's not true. Maybe it's my quest to understand it, but if I just take a moment and release that quest, I might experience something different. And then that experience can be like a seed that begins to grow. It's something I recognize now. It's something I've touched. And that's different from the life I've been living when I'm driven by the personality, right? Again, not making the personality wrong, just describing it as a stuck place. Because there's sometimes when that gift of your type are exactly the skillful ways that you can express your divine potential. But when it's the only way, then we're not free. Yeah. Any reflections as well as questions?
So Nhien, just building on what you've shared now, so that space between stimulus and response, and you're speaking about bringing awareness, which allows something else to emerge. I'm just wondering if you have any other sort of, with working with the Enneagram on this journey, any other practices or awarenesses that are really helpful that you use or recommend?
Yeah, thank you. Great question. Actually, I've been referring to centering prayer, but maybe I should describe it just a little bit more, and then I'll add on to it welcoming prayer practice. So centering prayer, I actually have like this free download on my website. I can share a link to that to give some of the steps. But so, that classic, it's simple but not easy, I think really, really applies here, is as simple as picking a sacred word, a word that is the symbol of your consent. The traditional language is consent to the activity and presence of God in your consciousness. But for me, in my interspiritual groups, some people's like consenting to divine light or consenting to my higher power can be. So, but it is my way of saying, in a way, think of it as the Enneagram symbol of I'm on the edge of my type, I'm on the circumference, and I consent to the fullness of the whole circle. So we pick a sacred word. Mine happens to be peace, and it has been this same word since 2007. Many of the sevens I know want to change their word every time, but then they get occupied with thinking about the next new word, and so they get wrapped up in their heads. And then, yeah, Ingrid's laughing. I want to say also something else people have learned teaching this. If you struggle because you are such a thinking type, try a sacred image. Try the image of a candle. Try something that doesn't activate the thinking mind as much. If a word is like, oh, well, let me think about my word now, right? So a sacred word or image. And this is very different from some of the Buddhist meditation where you're trying to focus on your word. The word is not a mantra. Your image is not to be focused on. It's actually basically you set the intention of consenting to emptying into that space. And then what you do is when you find that thoughts have begun to fill your screen again, if you catch yourself, it's like you use the sacred word and it's like this anchor. Like I physically one time, I could feel I was on like the thought train to Alaska. I was like, whoa, I was over there. You don't have to take the train all the way back home. You take your word, for me, peace. And it was almost like, it's like I jump home, like it jumped back in here. And then I just self-empty. Cynthia Bourgeault once described it beautifully because the goal of empty, to be empty, I don't know. I know I have not been able to achieve this at any great length, but the process of emptying is doable. It's a verb to empty. And she describes it as a windshield wiper. Your sacred word is like, here you go, it's raining, it's pouring, but windshield wiper, empty. Oh, look at the water's going to get empty. That's all you have to do. The invitation is to do it for 20 minutes, twice a day. And so that's a lot. And for some people, they start with 5 or 10. And so, but again, so the idea, and the difference between this practice and others is that the practice, Father Thomas Keating, one of the founders of this centering prayer practice, said the fruits of the practice are not in the practice, but in our lives. I love that. I'm very pragmatic, right? So, but what I mean by that is a lot of times people go to meditation to become peaceful. So centering prayer does not always make you peaceful. Like it could stir up old beliefs and all that, right? So, but the idea is if you just stay committed as a leap of faith. Someone said it works. I don't know if I believe it, but like what I've seen is the steadiness of people who practice it. Those are the people in our community that I see transform the most over time, not like this quick fix world, right? And so the fruits of the practice, so don't look for it. Don't be like, oh, I had a bad meditation because I wasn't peaceful. Just doing it is what it takes. Just showing up for it with that intention to open, to release. And then my ego says, no, these are important. You should be doing this instead. And every time I resist, that muscle gets weaker. The muscle of that personality structure gets weaker because I've actually said no to it rather than bought into it, right? So the practice is simply to do that for 20 minutes. Again, some people say that you should at least practice for 6 months before you decide whether or not centering prayer is for you. But this is what we do in all our groups, right? And again, we do it imperfectly, haphazardly, but just showing up for it and being open. There are times when it's literally maybe 30 seconds, but it does feel like I dropped somewhere else and there was space. 30 seconds in 20 minutes. And I've been doing this since 2005. That's like that bliss moment, right? Yeah. So the other practice is welcoming prayer practice. And I can't pronounce her last name, developed by Mary. If anyone else can pronounce it, Murawski, I know some of you know this teacher. So welcoming prayer for me, it's been said, I think Cynthia Bourgeot said, if centering prayer is what we do twice a day for 20 minutes, welcoming prayer is what we do all day long. And so welcoming prayer to me is the greatest act of like love that I can commit. It says that whatever my current experience, like I can feel like with all my growth in this moment, I feel like I'm 15 years old and grouchy and like unevolved, right? Like whatever I'm experiencing inside, I welcome. And so welcoming practice has these steps. And again, maybe Jill has another link as well, but there is one on my website. The first thing is to sink into your feeling as a sensation in your body. So it might be like, I feel sad. So instead of like, I feel sad, which can often be an idea, oh, my stomach feels heavy. There's like a dark color. The sensation of this heaviness feels like a weight in me. And I focus on that and I stay as long as I can. Because a lot of times people say, oh, I've grieved that. I've been grieving that for years. And it was like, you've been feeling it for like 2 seconds and then telling a story about it for the next 3 hours, then recycling the feeling because of your story. Have you actually been feeling sad, right? Welcoming prayer drops me into my actual sensation of sadness. That's the first step. So step one is stay with that for as long as you can. And when you find that your mind starts to analyze, because how many of us practitioners are like, well, I know why I feel this way, right? We go right there. As soon as we analyze something, we're out of the sensation. So just dropping back into the felt sensation. I sometimes guide people in this. And so it's helpful sometimes for them to actually describe the physical sensation to me to help them stay. So dropping in, that's step one. Step two, and this varies depending on your tradition, is so it's a welcoming practice. So the first step is, in a way, you're welcoming the sensation in your body. Step two is welcome in the presence of God as you understand God. For some people, it's just welcoming in love. Yeah. So Cynthia Bourgeot, again, now that we've mentioned her, I'm quoting her all the time now, once described the second step as when this happens, like let's say I had anger, it's like red, When I invite in the presence of God, it's like the red drop of anger goes into this oceanic awareness. But I'm still welcoming the anger. I'm not pushing it away, right? So I welcome in the presence of God so that I feel support here. And then I continue to gently welcome whatever my experience is, anger, sadness, still as a sensation in my body. And then this last step has actually been informed by the Enneagram, and I'll explain that in a second. So the last step is like a cleanup step, like to whatever extent, these are the barriers to me actually welcoming my experience. Number one, I release the need for power or control over this experience or the situation, right? And that's been most attributed to 891, the body types, power and control. I release the need for approval and esteem around this feeling or experience. Many of us heart types, it's like, is it okay? Will this break my relationships? How will this affect that? I release the need for approval or esteem around this feeling or experience. And then the final one, I release the need for certainty or security around this feeling or experience. Head types. But we're doing a cleanup. We're going to cover all of them, right? 5, 6, 7. But that tends to be a stopping point when I see for head types on the Enneagram. So we clean that up. I release the need to change anything about this experience, and I release the need to change anything about myself. And this is the paradox of the spiritual journey. Many people will say that it is actually releasing the need to change my experience that then changes my experience. But whenever I push it away, it just keeps enduring, right? Repeating. But somehow now, my life experience flows through me. Then I'm not building up more woundedness every day. It moves through me. And then I can meet each moment with greater freshness. And I'm not going to judge myself if I happen to have a huge trigger. I don't know, things, centering prayer stuff is coming up, and then someone does something and boom, I have a huge trigger. I'm not going to be like, oh, well, I shouldn't be like this anymore. I've been doing my work for 10 years, 20 years, right? Instead, it's like, oh, here it is. It hit me. Oh, and I feel that grief. And I just treat that grief like it's fresh and new, and I will welcome it. And I will bring in the presence of the divine into it. And then I release, do a little cleanup to make sure that I'm really welcoming it, as opposed to secretly welcoming it so it will go away. We are subtle beings that trick ourselves all the time, right? So this is a subtle practice. But it doesn't matter. Like, you don't have to get it perfect. I think the willingness starts to shift, and the sense of relief, the sense of the way that we become freer again to show up, right, starts to happen. Like, I had excruciating shyness, and I learned that shyness is really I-ness. Like, I was way too focused on caring about what you think of me to actually serve you. Right? To even learn that, right? Because people are like, oh, I'm shy. Like, when people are like, oh, I'm humble, like 9s are like, oh, well, no. Like, false humility. I was like, there's a divine light seeking to shine in and as you, right? And make sure you know what your egoic structure tends to say, because usually that it can be a little suspicious if it's that story that's like keeping you back, right? Yeah. So welcoming prayer practice, rinse and repeat, right? Yeah. Yeah. And again, in my 3-ness, like, I think people would be surprised how often, if I feel upset about something, I take a lot of time for it. I take a lot of time to be with that, because I believe that what is happening here is the foundation for everything else. And even in Unity, we have this metaphysical or allegorical interpretation of the Bible that says, seek first the kingdom, all else will be added. Like, we don't interpret it literally, like some heaven afterlife, but like there's this seek first a consciousness of peace. Seek first this consciousness of unity. Seek first that oneness. Seek it first. And then what you need to do, what you need to have, where you need to go, all else will be added. And again, you don't have to believe this, but I think the invitation is maybe you could try it on. Right. All right.
I noticed when you were speaking about the power, esteem, and safety. And I remember in that book, The Sacred Enneagram, that was very well put together, the Henry Noven and the Thomas Keating, around how our ego strategies in the three centers are particularly designed around those three.
Yes.
And so helpful to know what we're looking for, like the fake cure. We're looking for power as the fake cure. We're looking for esteem as the fake cure, and security as the fake cure for that core existential suffering.
Mm-hmm.
And what I'm hearing you teaching is, if we can just stay with our actual experience, which includes pain, which includes being triggered. And when you spoke about like going into emptiness, being courageous enough really to do that emptying. Everything you're saying is coming together so beautifully. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, your listening is profound. I mean, I can hear how deeply and well you listen. Yeah. Anything else?
I was struck by, I didn't know centering prayer before, but I started doing transcendental meditation in my 20s, and it sounds like pretty much the same thing, except they give you a mantra word, which is not a word that's recognizable to me as a concept in English, like peace or something. And I find that that's actually quite helpful, that I'm saying a word or using a word as my focus that has no meaning. It's just a sound, a two syllable sound. So, and I'm reflecting on how different it might be if I did choose a word that had meaning for me as a representation of something. So that's opened up a new possibility. So thank you for the detail around the centering prayer and the other one, what was it called?
Welcoming prayer.
The welcoming prayer, beautiful. In terms of any other awarenesses, perhaps linked to the Enneagram particularly, that are useful to us in our daily lives.
Yeah, well, I think it would be helpful to have specific questions about I can give an example of a specific type. But before I do that, I do want to go back to Ingrid's comment about the Sacred Enneagram, because I think this is an important book in the contemplative Enneagram tradition. And because Chris Heuertz has had some challenges in his journey, and so has kind of been canceled by a lot of different groups, I do want to name that his work profoundly impacts my own, and I want to honor him in that way, to share that. And that related to that, when Ingrid was mentioning it, she reminded me that one of the things that Chris teaches in the book that I've been applying in all my groups in a way that really supports people is the contemplative postures of silence, solitude, and stillness. And so I want to speak to those practices, and hopefully that will actually answer Renate's question as well. But there's this idea that while we all need all three, in a way as ways of self-emptying, right? In ways of not feeding into our compulsion, that we especially need one of them, depending on where our type is. And so the idea that he proposed that seems to be applicable to the people I've been working with over the years is stillness is especially recommended for the body types, right? 8, 9, and 1. So if there's a practice, because 8, 9, and 1 will be like, well, okay, well, I will do my walking meditation, and that's good. But there's something about stilling yourself from your compulsion. And 9s are like, well, a lot of 9s would be like, well, I am very still yet. Like I sleep, I mean, to exaggerate a little bit, but that's kind of often the case. But the idea is that we still ourselves from the unnecessary doing in 9ness. So the practice of stillness builds this muscle of restraint from acting out that compulsion, the need of all in the body center to have this impact, to feel like I am impacting the world without being impacted by it, which is very common to the body center, right? Solitude for the heart center makes so much sense. So, I mean, I remember when I was in relationship to a type 2, who were like, let's go on this meditation retreat, let's do it together. And, and the need to be in a space as a heart type, 2, 3s, and 4s, where you are not being mirrored by another, so that something true can arise. I mean, I was even aware of how I had to stop journaling on one retreat that I did as a solitary retreat. So solitude as a practice for the heart types, just because it's like, who am I when I'm not being reflected back? Like, so I was journaling, but I was like, in my journal, it wasn't personal journaling. I was talking to somebody in my journal. Like I was telling them, I could feel the energy of like, without that sense of communicating, who am I? And if I don't have bits of time where I'm nourished by the knowing of like the divine image, right? That it only shows up when I release other people's images of me, even my image of myself, right? So that practice, so whether it's like going on, for some people, it's taking an hour by yourself in the park. And for others, it could be a whole weekend, like retreat. So the first is stillness. Again, good for everyone, but particularly body types, solitude, and then silence for the head types, 5, 6, 7. And so that is about this resistance to the eternal quest for understanding and knowing, to give space for an interior silence. And if you are properly a head type, you should know that that's not the immediate thing that happens. So that's okay. Because you're like, oh, well, I don't do meditation well, because as soon as I sit, my mind, and that is what it will do in the beginning. But that practice of letting go with the sacred word, it's like somehow then the mind keeps going, but it's like doesn't always expect you to go along anymore. Because for moments you're not. And that builds space. To me, what I've seen is for greater wisdom. So that the head space, the figuring out gives way to like a more profound wisdom. Right? And I'll go back a step, that like for the heart types, it's almost like there's heart types to me are about identity, right? And so it's like, who am I? It's like this knowing of who I am, And so with head types, I see a lot more of the desire for security and certainty, and that is saved by not only greater wisdom, but a greater holding of, again, what I said earlier, mystery, uncertainty of the world because of a certainty that underlies you. Like the 6 that finds a ground of being as a felt experience. And I know a 6 who's actually been focusing on her joy lately, like how amazing. She's like, oh, before it's like I can, like in my garden, I would just look at what was wrong. Oh, and that the plants need to be moved because they're going to die in the sun. And you're like, the incessant worrying that gives way to a deeper trust that allows her a sense of relaxation. And I say that these things happen over time, but I also want to make space for, to me, grace can happen in a moment too. I just don't want to give anyone pressure, like, oh, well, it didn't happen in this moment, but just to be available, that there's like willingness, like to be available for that. And again, not for the future, but how about for now? And then again for now, right? And so if you can infuse those three postures, but emphasize the one for your number into your practice even this week and see how it goes. Remember that Michael Singer quote of like, yeah, if you want to know why you do something, don't do it, right? And why, again, my practice is that letting go. It's the resistance of the pattern, not because it's bad, but because it's fixated. And the more often I practice resistance, then in a moment when I need to show up with some other aspect of my humanity, there's space for it. There's room. Right. So, yeah.
And in my work with the submodalities with Tom Condon, the head types are generally very much in their head, in imagery and in language already. And I would say the practices that I've seen being more effective, definitely for myself and for other head types, is somatic awareness, introspection, connecting with the immediacy of the here and now, like becoming aware of the soles of my feet, for example, multiple times a day. And just not having a thought or a mantra or a word, just letting everything just unravel and float away and dropping into heart mind, full of awareness, in embeddedness, in the immediacy of the materiality of being incarnated. Because I think that's what the head types are really resisting, is actually being here, because it's overwhelming and unsafe to be incarnated as a human being. That's where the existential terror comes from. So being able to find the capacity to be with the absolute mystery of our embeddedness here, now, without words or images, I've found much more helpful than something like TM or anything involving words or images. So I just wanted to offer that as well.
Yes, I love that. And in fact, in our weekly groups, oftentimes the opening meditative practice includes first a dropping into the body. And it's actually from Cynthia Bourgeault, and I think she got it from Gurdjieff, the where are your feet? Like just that question. And in that body's answer, there is a moment. Yeah.
100%. And with like Tom Condon, I'll arrive in the room with him, blah, 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 and he says, how are your feet? He's not interested in my whole story. Like that's what he does to break the trance of time. If you've got some big story, like this is the line to one and all this, start talking about the harmonics, all this Enneagram jargon. He says, what's for lunch? It's
Right.
not going with you into anything mental.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah,
so good.
Helpful. Yeah, it's just so wonderful.
Yes, I love that. Thank you for sure. And so to your question earlier, when I was responding that there is a uniqueness to each person who comes before me, right? That level of development, but also orientation on the Enneagram. And there is that place of, you reminded me that I was working with a type 8 who was fairly brand new. I mean, she was this powerhouse woman who was this wife of an ambassador living in a foreign country and just had this all together. And she was joking with me about how she listens to most podcasts on like 2.5 speed, and like nothing slower than that, everything's fast. And, and all I did was I asked her to take a breath between her sentences. So as she still went, just take a breath, and then speak the next sentence. And she started to bawl. She started to cry. And then out came her fears around her daughter and the fact that they're about to move again, and her, just her desire to protect her daughter. And then there began this journey of like how she's like, oh yeah, I've touched my feelings more. And as a result, like somehow my daughter was like having issues, but when I started feeling more, my daughter started becoming more okay. And all this stuff came out around just this most vulnerable area of her life that was so tender, right? And so, yes, so there's some, I talked earlier about sort of an effortless life, but it's skillful effort, right? The effort of injecting something, putting a wedge into the spoke of your thinking, right? That's what Where Are My Feet does. So it's not just, people who are new to meditation to come in my course. I'm like, I know it feels like you're not doing anything of meaning here. like, why are we focusing on this? Because we're training and disciplining our mind's attention, because we don't even realize what ways we default and are not free in this default, in this habit of thinking. And so it may not be just that, focusing on your feet is helpful, but it might be helpful for you to know why it's so hard for you to not to do that, and what you would rather be thinking about instead, or doing instead of focusing on your feet. So something comes up around that, right? And that can come up for healing, right? And that's what I mean by earlier, so we break the pattern of type and there's a crack. So we just want just a little crack, any crack, right? And so that pattern is done by all of these practices. If you could guide your breath one way and your ego wants to guide another way, or find something else more interesting, right? Then you learn something, even if you weren't successfully able to focus, in that. You learn your own pattern of attention experientially. Right? And then eventually you're like, oh, and then again, a little bit more space is built. And that pattern is like you can get a choice rather than just being offset by it, right? Because the hope is over time, like with Ingrid's example with Tom, is that then Tom is not the one who does it all the time, that eventually Ingrid does, that she creates that wedge, right? She remembers, she pauses, she notices her feet. We receive the breath.
Thank you. It's so wonderful. And I love your metaphor of sticking something in the spokes. It's disrupting. He calls it scrambling the trance. So we actually, the trance is going on, and then you do something to just interrupt it for a second. And there's a bit of a shock because suddenly we're in a different space. It's almost like the meditation you did at the beginning. It takes us out of our trance into a different way of being in the moment. And, I like to use the metaphor of throwing a spanner in the works. So someone like Tom, that's what he does. He just throws a spanner in the works of your thinking and everything seizes up. And then you have one of those corrective experiences of, oh, for 10 seconds, I was here in a different possibility. I experienced a moment of presence with you where I felt safe. And just to know that that's possible allows me to take the chance of not being a 7 for 5 seconds tomorrow, so it's just lovely. What you're saying is just it's so resonant with the trauma healing work, with the other coaching work that I've been exposed to, and obviously with all the spiritual teachings. Just thank you. It's really great.
That's so wonderful. I do have one more thing I want to share. I know we're at time, but what you reminded me of is so important, because when people come to me, I want to be clear what my work is about. And you know, it is like a deepening of a path of transformation. And I think maybe all of us Enneagram practitioners, I am not trauma informed. So if someone is struggling to meditate because of trauma, I make a referral. That's such an important piece to all of this, to know where your lane is and where it's not. Like I have sent people to somatic experiencing therapists, right? Or an addiction specialist, just to remember that this is a piece at a certain level of development. But if I understand that someone has trauma, that's very, very important that I not be the one. As much as I would love, my ego would love to be the one that can help you through this, right? Go there first. And if you only have finances for that, do that only. You know, that's so important. And the last thing I'll share is there's something that I was reminded of earlier to say that Cynthia Bourgeault has specifically talked about the centering prayer practice. I think it was a podcast, it might be in one of her many books as well, as impacting the passion of our Enneagram type. I mean, in her words, it's like the passion, again, going back to the original word passio to mean suffering, the suffering of our type, the addiction of our type in our heart space. Many spiritual traditions have this notion of the purification of the heart. And I think modern religion has taken it in a very unhealthy way around like, we all need to be, quote, purified, right? But what I see it as being about is that literally what is happening when we are not doing a meditation that focuses attention. Again, I do that as part of my practice, but centering prayer is different in that her idea is that it's about releasing focus. Focus is very Western. Focus is a very Western approach, but it's almost like then there's like a freedom and a spaciousness. And in that spaciousness, it's like the divine purifies. And so the passion becomes purified into the virtue. And this makes a lot of sense to me as well, when, you know, a lot of traditional Christians are like, we act our way into our virtue, you know, we try to act like good people versus the actual awakening, like for the 3 of the authentic heart, right? For the 2 of the humble heart. Like there's an actual awakening that is not done by me, but appears to be done simply by me releasing what I think is needing to happen. And so she talks about it as a process of purification of that center, so that the fruits in our lives are, we just don't have that firm of a compulsion anymore. So I wanted to make sure to say that. Yeah. Thanks, Jen.
Yeah, thank you so much. We do have 5 minutes in case anybody has a burning question.
Hi, Nhien. I'll put
Hello.
some. So it occurs to me as you're speaking that I actually, initially when I first met the Enneagram and I learned that my passion was anger, I didn't get it. I think as many of us don't get it because it's so unconscious. And now that I get it completely, I realize what a comfort it is. And it's almost a safety. So if I don't have it, so my dad turns 90 tomorrow, and I've had a lot of anger towards my dad, especially since my mom died 3 years ago. And I've been working through that in my coaching. And that bucket of anger has diminished considerably, but I notice, because you were speaking about emptying ourselves, that I'm still keeping like a tiny bit, like there's still like a bit of stuff at the bottom of the bucket, because if I let that stuff go, then what? So the safety for me is, I've emptied it a lot, so I kind of feel cleared and open, and I feel like our relationship is so much better. But it's like, I'm just going to hold on to this little bit of anger because I'm actually right about your wrongness. And if I let this go, then I'm not safe because maybe you could hurt me even more. So it's kind of that feeling, So I'm so like the whole talk was so meaningful because it just reminded me of, oh my God, like I'm holding on to this little bit, and I'm afraid it's actually a fearfulness rather than a reluctance, because the spaciousness that I've achieved in emptying most of the bucket has been profound. But I know that like God's calling me to empty the bucket, empty it, Joel, empty it. And I'm like, no, it's good, like we're good. So I'm just wanting to offer that, because in our coaching work with clients, when we work with the vice, like it needs to be understood that our vice is our comfort, and if we ask somebody to take it away, oh my God, then I'm standing here naked in front of a pivotal relational figure in my life, my dad. So I can't do that. So I'm just going to keep a little bit of it. So I just wanted to kind of offer that as a reflection and a learning from what I've taken away. And I mean, your welcoming prayer invitation is profound. So thank you so much for that.
Yeah, thank you, Jill. So beautiful. Like I almost felt weepy hearing you. Like there was this like of release in that sense. Yeah, this felt sense. Thank you for your insight. Yeah. Oh, I see a comment in the chat as well. Yep. A fellow one saying anger is there to protect me. And with that, oh, I also love her. Yeah.
Well, that has been the most wonderful way to spend a Saturday afternoon, listening to your wonderful wisdom, Nhien, and your generosity of heart and spirit, and just been smiling the whole way through. It's just really touched and moved me and been deeply meaningful. So thank you for taking the time. And I'm sure that the many people who couldn't make it today will enjoy the recording just as much. So bless you and thank you for being with us. And thanks everybody for coming. Ing, you want to say anything by way of completion?
Thank you so much. That was absolutely wonderful. And I would love it if you could do the bowl again for us in closing.
100%. I saw that in the chat as I was reading. Thank you everyone for being here. I could feel you, even if you didn't ask verbal questions, and I appreciate everyone's presence here. So sort of in the name of not too much mental chatter, I think I'll just ring the bowl and not say anything after, just close with that. So I'll say it now. Sending peace. Oh, actually, from the Buddhist tradition, may the merit that has accrued from our time together, may it be for the benefit of all beings, not one left behind. So with that, I'll close.